RWBY Volume 2 is a massive improvement over Volume 1, but does that make it good? Well, kind of. But before we get into that, if you haven't watched my look back at Part 1, I'd recommend starting there to understand my perspective on the series and thoughts on Volume 1. With this, I'll be talking about Volume 2 and only Volume 2, so if a problem with the show gets fixed in later volumes, that's not relevant. Also, I'll be using the terms huntsman or huntress a lot in this video, so when I use one, I'm basically using them as gender-neutral terms, as saying both of them over and over gets exhausting. Now let's get right into looking at the show. From the very first episode, it's clear RWBY Volume 2 is a much more polished product than Volume 1. Gone are the silhouetted background characters of Volume 1, replaced with actual characters who they took the time to draw. Now they didn't always draw these characters well, but it's still a huge step up from only ever having the main characters have faces. A lot of jank of the characters' movements is ironed out, but a good bit still remains. The narrative is more focused, but only marginally so. Instead of going through every little detail, I'll be talking about the main things that hold this season back from being as good as it could be, at least in my opinion. First off, RWBY's world building is just plain bad. I don't know if it's because they didn't have the world thought out as much as they should have, or if they thought they'd trickle feed the audience information and just did a bad job of it, but whatever the reason, the world building holds the whole show back. Before I get into this, let me preface this by saying that world building is one of the hardest things to do in storytelling. It's a fine line of too much exposition and not enough exposition, one that very few stories handle well. Some of the greatest books and films ever made have bad world building. Lord of the Rings books and A Song of Fire and Ice often go way too far in their exposition to the point where they can read like history books. Some people love that, most people don't. So with that said, it's not really a surprise that RWBY is bad world building, but the problem is that RWBY's world building is so bad it actively detracts from the viewer's enjoyment. Now when I say it has bad world building, that doesn't mean the world itself is uninteresting or bad. It just means they do a bad job of giving the audience enough information to properly enjoy the show. RWBY doesn't need a Lord of the Rings level history to everything, nor does it need to fill in the audience even as much as something like Harry Potter does. At the end of the day, world building is just another tool to get the audience invested in the story being told. Some stories are structured around world building, where seeing the world and learning more about it is one of the primary reasons the audience cared. Attack on Titan is a great example of this. Other shows, like RWBY, place their focus more on the characters with the world being the backdrop that they're in. That's fine, but the audience needs to be given enough to have some type of understanding of the world that they are in, especially when it's so different from our world. Because of this problem, RWBY's audience has no sense of perspective for anything that happens in Volume 2. The audience has no details on what a huntsman is, how much stronger they are than our characters, or what the hell they even do. All we're given is a few lines of vague dialogue here and there. The audience knows that they train to fight monsters, but that's where their knowledge ends. This isn't acceptable because of the fact that, at the time of Volume 2, the main point of the story seems to be watching our characters train to become huntress. Let's compare this with some other shows that are more or less about a character wanting to become something. Naruto establishes early on that the Hokage is the leader of the village and a very strong ninja, so the audience knows what it is he's aiming for and how far he has to go. My Hero Academia doesn't establish exactly what the top hero is, but that's because it doesn't need to. Superheroes are a concept everyone is familiar with, so there's no need to explain what they are or what they do, and being the top hero is rather self-explanatory. The concept of a huntsman isn't one that any viewer will be familiar with coming into RWBY, so the audience needs to be told or shown what they are. How strong are they compared to Team RWBY? Are they government employees? Or is the term huntsman more like a license you earn, kinda like in Hunter x Hunter? What exactly do they do? Why are they needed if it seems like the military can handle Grimm just fine? Because the audience doesn't know these things, large parts of the story feel kinda pointless. Yet again, the audience isn't given a reason to care. It feels like our characters have an unspecific goal that the audience is in the dark to as to what it entails, and that actively detracts from the viewing experience. I mean, as far as I can tell, the characters are all plenty strong, so why aren't they Huntress already? Sure, at the end, Yang and Weiss lose fights, but it seems like Weiss could have won had she stabbed her opponent in one of the many times when he was on the ground, and while Yang was clearly outclassed, we have no reference for how strong her opponent was. This lack of knowledge about what it is our characters are working towards gives the whole story a lack of perspective. The audience cannot put anything that happens into an easily understood perspective because they don't know anything about the world. world. The main characters seem incredibly strong because we don't know what incredibly strong is in the world of RWBY, we can only compare it to our world. These world building problems are especially frustrating because RWBY has a character that it seems like was made to be a tool for the audience to get exposition. John is what I call the clueless character. Clueless characters are fairly common in stories and are easy ways for the writer to dump exposition on the audience. If you have a character that knows as little as the audience knows, then it's only logical that they would ask the questions the audience wants to ask. So while it'd be weird for someone like Yang, whose uncle, stepmom, and dad are all huntsmen, to ask for clarification on what they are, John not being completely sure about what huntsmen are or the specifics of what they do would be completely in character. However, John never seems interested in asking questions the audience is wondering. In fact, the only time he's even really used to his full potential as a clueless character is very early on in Volume 1, when they have Pyrrha exposition dump the concept of aura to him and the audience. Using a clueless character like this isn't exactly groundbreaking or clever, but it doesn't need to be. So now that I've beaten the dead horse that is RWBY's world building problems, let's move on to the actual story itself. Like I said, there's an actual story here instead of just random events. I could talk about how what serves as the inciting incident for the series is arguably the season 1 finale, but let's just focus on season 2's story. The fact that it even has a cohesive narrative is a massive improvement over Volume 1, but that bar was set so low even the world's greatest limboist would need a shovel to go under it, so that's not exactly an accomplishment. The story lacks focus and seems rather tone deaf the whole time. It goes from, we have to stop this evil plot that we're in the dark about and the whole city could be in danger, to, let's go to prom and look, John's wearing a dress. Now don't get me wrong, I actually like the idea of them going to a school dance, but I think it was executed poorly, causing tonal whiplash. Now I am all for a show having multiple tones. When done correctly, having multiple tones that a show shifts between can greatly enhance the viewing experience. However, RWBY just doesn't handle it all that well. One of the major themes of Volume 2 is that our characters are having to grow up faster than they should, and their days of being kids are rapidly coming to an end. This is shown in everything, from Ozpin outright saying it in the first episode, to the opening song, to the fact that at the end of the season, Team RWBY goes on a mission meant for people older, showing that they're doing things they shouldn't have to do yet because of the times they live in. While not a particularly original theme, it could have been one that elevated RWBY to being something truly great. It's just not done all that well. We've seen all these characters mess around and be kids for all of Volume 1, so the idea that things are going to change soon is an intriguing one. At its core, RWBY is a character-driven series. The strength of character-driven series is getting the audience to like the characters and then changing the status quo. It's interesting for the audience to see these characters they know and love have their world changed and see how they react to it. This theme overall is a great theme for RWBY and is a very intriguing idea. RWBY just doesn't commit to it enough. The dance should have been utilized as the perfect example of this theme, but instead it's just a missed opportunity. For example, what if instead of just RWBY, who never wanted to be at the dance in the first place, most of our main cast leaves the dance to go after Cinder? It could have been used to show the juxtaposition between what they should be doing as kids and the responsibilities they're having to take on as huntsmen. It would show our characters having stupid fun like the kids they are one minute and having to confront death and terrorism the next. It would be a symbolic moment, a time where these kids recognize that there are things more important than their school lives, and make the choice to leave that behind in order to try and do some good. Furthermore, it could establish Cinder as a threatening villain. Escaping RWBY alone isn't that impressive, but had she escaped from most of Team RWBY and Juniper, that would have been impressive, and shown that our characters aren't quite ready for this stage yet, but they need to be. But instead, all we get is, LOL, prom sure is cool, isn't it? And that's just frustrating. In fact, if I had to use one word as a whole to sum up RWBY Volume 2, it would be frustrating. There's so many moments when it feels like the show is on the cusp of becoming something great and it just fails every time. There's a lot of wasted potential, and as a viewer, I just felt constantly let down. Now before I finish this look at, I want to touch on the one thing that I feel goes often underappreciated in RWBY. The moment-to-moment dialogue, that is, how the characters talk to one another, is usually excellent. It's engaging, well-written, and often clever. This is a lot harder to do than most would think, and I think it's a large reason for RWBY's success. RWBY Volume 2 is all about give and take. For every great action scene or fun scene of character back and forth, there's also a scene that's a little pointless, or one that just reeks of missed opportunity. However, RWBY Volume 2 never commits the worst sin a show like it could. It is never boring. And a show, especially a shorter show, can get a long way on just being fun to watch. RWBY is still consistently engaging and moves so quickly it never even gives you time to sit back and think about why you still watch it. And luckily for the fans of the show that had stuck around this long, they would have their time rewarded with Volume 3, where the quality finally catches up with the potential of the show. Because I have a lot more to say about each individual episode of Volume 3, I've decided to do those reviews individually, or at least group them by story segment. So the first of those should be out in the next few days. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe, and feel free to check out my last video. I also have some other videos I'm working on, but those are a little ways off. This has been the Triumphant Trumpet. Thanks for watching.